You know, when we think of the Battle of Culloden, pop culture usually paints this really specific, romanticized picture. We imagine a heroic, doomed Scotland making a final stand against an oppressive English empire. Basically, a dramatic clash of nations. But the reality that unfolded on that freezing, sleet-swept moor on April 16, 1746, it was radically different. We're talking about the brutal, bloody conclusion to a civil war. And, factually speaking, it remains the absolute last pitched battle ever fought on British soil. Let's dive into this explainer and see what really happened.
So, here's a wild thought, and a pretty provocative question to kick things off. Was the most famous Scottish battle in history actually fought by more Scots against Bonnie Prince Charlie than for him? Well, the truth is, our pop culture understanding of Culloden is fundamentally flawed. When you actually tally up the loyalist clans, the militias raised in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and the regular Scottish regiments of the British Army, there were ultimately more Scots in arms against Prince Charles Edward Stuart than there were fighting for him. It's crazy, right? This is a deeply complex ideological struggle that literally tore families apart.
Part 1. A misunderstood civil war, shattering the Scotland versus England myth.
To really understand the Civil War reality of this conflict, we just have to look at the clan loyalties. They were split right down the middle, with significant Scottish forces fighting hard to secure the Hanoverian crown. For example, Clan Cameron and the Stuarts of Appin fought fiercely for the Jacobites. But directly across the moor from them stood the Argyll militia, which was comprised almost entirely of Clan Campbell, along with historically Presbyterian clans like the Munros and Grants, all fighting for the government. It gets even darker. In tragic cases, like Clan Maclean, men were actually forced by feudal tendency to fire upon their own kinsmen.
Now you might be wondering, what exactly was driving all this? What is Jacobitism? Ultimately, this uprising was essentially a European proxy war, instigated by France, rather than a localized fight for Scottish independence. The term Jacobite actually comes from Jacobus, that's the Latin for James, representing their core goal to restore the exiled House of Stuart to the throne. But here's the catch. France, heavily embroiled in the War of the Austrian Succession against Britain, basically saw the Jacobites as the perfect diversionary tactic. By backing Prince Charles, France was just hoping to force Britain to pull its best troops out of Europe.
Part 2. Rivals and the lead-up. A collision course to Drumossie Moor. The contrast between the two men leading these armies really set the stage for tragedy. On one side, you have the inexperienced, overconfident Bonnie Prince Charlie. He believed entirely in his divine right to rule. He was charismatic, he was bold, for sure, but his actual military experience, it literally amounted to a few days observing a siege when he was a teenager. Opposite him was his distant cousin, William Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland. He was only 24, but already the Captain General of the British Army. He was a ruthless, strict disciplinarian, a highly experienced veteran of European combat, and he had spent months relentlessly drilling his veteran redcoats.
Before a single shot was even fired, the Jacobites were already at a massive, almost insurmountable disadvantage. Just think about the physical condition of these men. The Jacobite army, about 5,000 to 6,000 men, had just spent a grueling winter retreating from a totally failed invasion of England. They were freezing, exhausted, poorly armed, and hadn't eaten properly in days. Meanwhile, Cumberland's government forces numbered up to 9,000. They were well-rested, well-fed, highly drilled professional soldiers with essentially unlimited ammunition.
Part 3. The Fatal Battlefield Choice. A chain of strategic disasters.
Okay, picture this. It's the night before the battle. Knowing Cumberland's troops were over in Nairn celebrating the Duke's birthday with extra rations of brandy, the Jacobites attempt a daring 20-mile night ambush. Sounds good in theory, right? But navigating the rugged Scottish terrain in pitch darkness right in the middle of a thunderstorm proved absolutely impossible. Columns got separated, massive delays set in, and the whole mission had to be aborted. The men had to trudge all the way back. By the morning of the battle, they had effectively sleepwalked nearly 20 miles in freezing rain on empty stomachs for absolutely nothing.
So, combine that sheer exhaustion with some truly terrible leadership decisions, and the Jacobites found themselves trapped on the worst possible terrain. Lord George Murray actually begged the prince not to fight on Drumossie Moor because it was flat and incredibly boggy. See, the Jacobites relied on the Highland charge, a terrifying all-out sprint into close-quarters combat. A saturated bog completely destroyed their momentum. To make matters worse, fragile clan egos derailed them further. The MacDonald regiments were so insulted by being placed on the left flank instead of their traditional right, they essentially sulked and refused to fully engage.
And then there's the artillery. This was absolutely crucial. The battle was heavily dictated by a massive disparity in firepower. The government army had highly trained Royal Artillery crews, smoothly operating a unified battery of cannons. The Jacobites, on the other hand, had a mismatched collection of guns manned by untrained civilians. And, tragically, they actually brought the wrong size cannonballs for some of their weapons. When the battle kicked off, Prince Charles hesitated. The Jacobite line stood perfectly still for nearly half an hour, just absorbing horrific, pinpoint punishment from government cannons without even being ordered to advance.
Part 4. 40 minutes of slaughter. The collapse of the Highland charge.
Now this is fascinating from a military history standpoint. Cumberland fundamentally re-engineered British infantry tactics, specifically to neutralize that terrifying Highland broadsword charge. Traditionally, a Highlander charged holding a wooden shield, called a targe, on his left arm. He'd catch an enemy's bayonet with it, leaving the soldier totally exposed to a lethal sword strike. Cumberland's solution? He drilled his men to stop thrusting straight ahead. Instead, every soldier was trained to thrust his bayonet to the right, aiming directly under the raised sword arm of the Highlander attacking the man next to him. It bypassed the shield completely. But it required literal nerves of steel and total trust in the guy standing beside you.
When the Highland charge was finally ordered, it turned into a doomed, chaotic crush. Modern archaeological evidence proves they were funneled straight into a horrific crossfire. To avoid the worst of the bogs, the center clans veered right, completely crashing into their own men and forming a massive, disorganized bottleneck pinned against enclosure walls. As they closed the distance, government cannons switched from solid iron balls to canister shot. This essentially turned the cannons into giant shotguns. Despite marching into an absolute storm of lead, the Highlanders hit the first government line with such incredible ferocity they actually punched right through it. But waiting right behind was a second line of reserves. They simply leveled their muskets and fired staggered, continuous platoon volleys at point-blank range into the trapped Jacobite mass.
If you track the timeline of this whole thing, it's just shockingly fast. The Jacobite resistance completely deteriorated in less than an hour. In just 3 terrifying minutes of hand-to-hand combat, over 700 Jacobites fell. Recognizing the charge had completely lost its momentum and they were now being flanked by British cavalry, sheer panic set in. The Jacobite army broke and fled. A small, brave contingent of French-Irish regulars made a last stand to allow the survivors to escape, but for all intents and purposes, the battle was over.
Part 5. Aftermath and Cultural Repression. The Grim Price of Defeat.
Those 40 bloody minutes left a staggering disparity in casualties, which really highlights why Cumberland earned the grim nickname, the Butcher. Roughly 1,500 Jacobites died, many literally hacked down by pursuing cavalry as they ran toward Inverness. In stark contrast, the government forces lost an officially recorded 50 men. Cumberland then issued an order of no quarter, meaning absolutely no mercy. His soldiers walked the battlefield, systematically executing the wounded with bayonets and musket butts. And in the weeks that followed, British troops scoured the Highlands, burning homes, driving off livestock, and carrying out summary executions of anyone even suspected of rebel sympathies.
And what about Boney Prince Charlie? Well, he fled the field in absolute ruin. A massive bounty of £30,000 was placed on his head, which is equivalent to millions of dollars today. Yet remarkably, loyal Highlanders never betrayed him during his 5 months on the run. He hid in the wilderness, eventually famously dressing up as an Irish maid named Betty Burke to be smuggled onto the Isle of Skye by Flora MacDonald. He successfully escaped to France, never to return, and actually lived out the rest of his life as an embittered alcoholic. But the tragedy is, he left his devoted followers behind to face the full, unbridled wrath of the British Empire.
The retaliation didn't stop at the battlefield. The British government moved immediately to systematically erase Highland culture entirely, ensuring they could never rebel again. Parliament viewed Highland martial culture as inherently linked to Jacobite treason, so they literally legislated it out of existence. The Act of Proscription of 1747 completely banned traditional Highland dress. If you were caught wearing a kilt, you could be shipped off to overseas colonies as an indentured servant. They restricted the Gaelic language, forcibly disarmed the region, and shattered the traditional feudal power of the clan chiefs. An ancient way of life was deliberately and methodically wiped out.
Part 6. Learnings from the Battle. The Anatomy of a Disaster Concluded.
So, what are the big takeaways from this explainer? Ultimately, Culloden was never a romantic struggle between two separate nations. It was a brutal, incredibly lopsided civil war decided by strict military discipline. A starving, exhausted civilian army relying on outdated shock tactics and broadswords was funneled into a bog and systematically dismantled by a well-fed, highly mechanized professional war machine. The romanticized myths cooked up in the 19th century honestly do a massive disservice to the brutal reality of the men who actually bled and died in that mud.
It really forces us to ask a pretty grim question. What happens when ancient traditions clash head-on with the ruthless, mechanized efficiency of modern professional warfare? The Highland Charge had won battles for centuries. It was legendary. But on April 16, 1746, it ran headfirst into the dawn of modern artillery and synchronized fire discipline. Raw courage and bravado simply could not overcome canister shot and massed volley fire.
The echoes of those bloody 40 minutes on Drumossie Moor resonated through the centuries, dismantling a way of life that would never return. It definitively secured the Hanoverian dynasty and allowed the British Empire to comfortably focus its immense military might globally, and it paved a grim way for the Highland clearances. The ghosts of Culloden still loom large, reminding us that history is rarely as simple or as romantic as the legends suggest. It kind of leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How much of the history we revere today is built on myth, and what other uncomfortable truths are hiding just beneath the surface of our favorite legends?